I've been
that is why.
I've been to Haddonfield.
So yeah, so that's
all
like
the sign, but I've never worn it.
exactly. So one person's been to the tavern. You've been to the tavern?
Yeah.
How long ago?
Will they be the first night?
First night.
Yeah,
Okay.
one of those.
Okay. So a while ago, probably.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And how many people have been to Haddonfield?
I've been in the town, but I've never been in those places.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm really glad that you're here today. Hello.
It's a beautiful place and weekends.
It is a beautiful place. I was going to say it's only about a half-hour drive. It's got a lovely main street there called King's Highway. Lots of shops, lots of restaurants, and the museum. And the museum where I work, the Indian King Tavern Museum. So it's not actually a tavern. You can't eat there. So you go there to kind of get a tour, learn the history, and then you go just like 5 minutes down the road to eat. It's really easy. But Indian King Tavern is actually open 5 days a week. We're only closed on Mondays and Tuesdays. So lots of options to visit. We're always there. You can come for like 10 minutes and walk around, or you can take a whole tour. So hopefully maybe after the presentation you'll be more inspired. Hopefully don't give too many spoilers. You'll say, I know everything, I don't need to go. But it's different, being in the place. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the museum, a bit about our history, about kind of taverns back in Revolutionary times. I kind of have a 2-part presentation, so we'll start with kind of our history of taverns. I'll take some questions. And then the second part, we're really going to dive into that Revolutionary War history and kind of what happened in the area during the Revolutionary War. So, hope you enjoy. Okay. So here is our lovely museum, so you can see what it looks like right in downtown Haddonfield. You see the little shield, Department of Parks and Forestry. So just like there's a National Park Service, we're part of like the State Park Service. So I'm a part-time state park ranger, I guess. We work with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And this building is actually the first historic building that was purchased by the state of New Jersey, 1903. So we really go back. So why did they care? Well, number one, this building was an operational tavern during the Revolutionary War. So tavern operations began in 1777. And then the other thing that happened in 1777, that was their big year, is they rented out the second floor to the government of New Jersey. So they were actually running the whole state of New Jersey during the Revolution from this building. So now you see why the state of New Jersey in 1903 is like, we want to buy this. This is like really cool history to remember. So we'll start, so you would say tavern, right? What is a tavern? There were really big deals back in 18th century when people needed to travel, they needed somewhere to stop, to have a bite to eat, or to just have a place to sleep before continuing on their journeys. Also a place for local people to come in, have a bite to eat, have a drink. So this is kind of a tavern scene from the time period. So I'm just going to ask you, what do you see? What do you notice? What are people doing?
Eating.
Eating?
There's the dog.
There's a dog, yeah.
It looks like backgammon.
Backgammon, exactly. Playing games, that's a
Social
big
gathering.
thing.
They
Huh?
pass them
Social
by.
gathering place.
Social gathering.
They pass them by and they rest them and they eat it and they making friends and talking about it, what is there.
Exactly, making friends, talking about what's going on. This is a time before, Google and social media and Twitter. So this is kind of like where everybody's meeting everyone else. It's like the proverbial water cooler where everyone gets together, where people learn news. There would often be newspapers at the tavern, so it's a place you can read the paper or just find out from other people, like what's happening. Ben Franklin had a joke that he'd go to a tavern and he would tell everyone all the news before even ordering his drink. He'd be like, my name's Ben Franklin, I am from here. No major news where I'm coming from. All right, here's what I want to eat. Because that's kind of what it was like. So we're going to go back a little to kind of set the scene for our tavern. So, of course, you want a place where people are going to stop. Good to be on a major road, right? So I don't know how, it's not so easy to see here, but try to see at the bottom where it says Haddonfield, maybe, at the bottom. And it's on this junction of a few major roads. So there was two of the first settlements of this area of New Jersey were Burlington and Salem. So there was a road going from Burlington to Salem, that goes through Haddonfield. And there's a road that goes straight from Philadelphia, also into Haddonfield. When you read the Philly papers back in the day, I joked the name for Haddonfield was a village 7 miles from Philadelphia.
Wow.
So, cross the river. Camden was really not a thing. There was called Cooper's Ferry, but it wasn't really built up. So Haddonfield is actually one of the early major settlements that you pass. And Haddonfield kind of become a settlement. It didn't grow up so much because it was on roads. It was more that it developed, and then the road started going through there. And that's really because of the founder of Haddonfield. She's on our seal, Elizabeth Haddon Estow. She was an immigrant from England. So her father, John Haddon, is the one who purchased the land in what became Haddonfield. But he was very busy in London. He couldn't actually come to America to claim his land. He had too much going on in London. So he sent his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, as his power of attorney, alone, age 20 or 21, across the ocean. Oh yeah, girl power. She's gonna claim the land. She's gonna deal with property disputes. So she comes there. Within a year, she marries a man named John Estow, who's a traveling missionary. So they're living together, they are farming. She calls her plantation Haddonfield after her father, so that's where we get the name Haddonfield. They set up a Quaker meeting house. They were very devout Quakers, and that's very important because the Quaker meeting house becomes a center, a social center, so now people are more inclined to want to live there. And the other thing that is really important is they're really like property developers. They're not just living on what was called a plantation, not just living on their farm and farming. She is selling off small plots of land along what later became the main road to small business people. So she's constantly selling off small plots. Later in life, she would actually hire architects to pre-build buildings that are with shops below and then somebody living above, and then try to either rent that out or sell it. So it's really this development, and that's what creates this kind of town of artisans and taverns that became Haddonfield. So one of the plots of land that she and John sell is where our building is located. So it's sold in the 1730s to a brewer named Timothy Matlack. Matlack's one of the old settlers, English settlers of the area. He's going to build a brewery on the site, maybe a shop as well, and that's where we have the first construction on our building. So, good. Next slide. And this is sort of a helpful picture. So, if you were coming to the town during Revolutionary War times, this building is what you would have seen. So, see the little two-story one there? That's the 1732 building built by Matlack. Then 10 years later, 1742, he's going to build a 3-story brick building. And then he's going to move to Philly. And basically, there's a bunch of owners, and somebody else builds the 3rd building there that kind of has a slanted roof called the Ark. But most of the people who own the property aren't living in the property. It becomes an investment property. So these are wealthy people in the area, and they've got tenants. Often you've got one person in one building, one another, one another. So it's kind of like a bunch of buildings. Got a bunch of tenants, got a bunch of landlords. One is called Aston, wealthy people who own the building. And then the other, there's a portrait, which may or not be him. And the questions I can go into more detail, but I'm lately thinking about 80% likelihood is a correct portrait of a man named Thomas Redmond. He is a local Quaker, very prominent clerk of the Haddonfield meeting. He purchases the property in 1775 as an investment property. Now we got to our big year. 1777, it becomes a tavern. So a couple moves in, they purchase the whole property. Their names are Hugh and Mary Creighton. And they're gonna knock down some walls, we're not sure, but they do a bunch of renovations, and they're gonna turn it into a tavern. But this is not their first rodeo. They're not new to the tavern business. They're actually moving a prior business from the other side of the street. So they have been operating a tavern for almost 20 years at this point. We'll get to what it was called in a minute. So they've been operating a tavern for almost 20 years at the other side of the street. And speaking of women in business, Mary was the original one who began as a tavern keeper. So Hugh was her second husband, not her first husband. She was married to a guy called Uriah French first, and they were living on a kind of farm area not far from downtown Haddonfield. and had a couple kids, and he gets sick and passes away. So she's left as a widow. She has 2 sons to support, ages 8 and 3. She needs a job. So she moves into town. She's renting a space, and her landlord and several other people in the community help to kind of sponsor her to apply for a license to run a tavern. So at that time, you don't just buy a building and put up a sign saying, "Hi, everybody, come here." You actually need a license from the county, which is Gloucester County at that time. So here we see from the original application, we, the subscribers, recommend Mary French as a person well qualified to keep a public house of entertainment. So that's kind of how it's done. She runs the tavern alone for about a year, and then she marries a second time to a man named Hugh Creighton. He'd been running a mill. He joins that tavern business, and as soon as they are a couple, all the rest of the license documentation, every year the license needs to be renewed, there's all this paperwork, all the rest of the documentation is in his name as soon as they marry. So we have 1 year Mary French, yeah, and then for the rest it's Hugh Creighton. So here's just like I gave a little example. A couple years later, we, the subscribers, do humbly request your worships, that's the judges in the court, to permit Hugh Creighton of Haddonfield to continue to keep a public house of entertainment. So it's kind of like a license renewal, every year. So there's Mary and Hugh, and then eventually they're going to go from renters to owners of this property. So women running taverns is maybe not as unusual as you might think. Records show in Philly about a quarter of colonial era tavern licenses are for women. So 1 out of 4 in Philly is a pretty high rate. Here in South Jersey, it doesn't seem to be as common. I went to the Trenton Archives, and I went to find Mary's application. So I was kind of looking at some of the others, and she's not the only woman, but it's way below 1/4. It looked more like 5 or 10% to me, but she wasn't the only one. Oh, and I did put a little quote there. So even women who were married, it's very common for a married couple to be running a tavern, and so if you're the guests coming in, that the wife is the one that you're kind of interacting with was really common. So kind of you come to a tavern and you deal with the landlady is very much of like a trope and a common thing at the time. And this is just a line, it's actually the song I'm going to play later, I'm realizing. A bottle and a kind landlady cures all again. So that's implying there's maybe a little bit more going on at the tavern. So not implying anything about Mary by that quote, but just that kind of idea. Come in, you're going to see the landlady a lot of the time, whether she's married or not. So, what's in the name? Why are we called the Indian King Tavern? Were there Indian kings around? No. Most of the Native Americans by 1777 were not in Haddonfield, with a very small population at that time. There was a Native American reservation at that time in the Pine Barrens called Brotherton and Chemong today, Indian Mills. So that's not that far. But Indian King was a very common tavern name. Philly had both an Indian King and an Indian Queen. It was just kind of considered cool and exotic. There's not really too much more to it than that. They thought it was kind of a fun name. And the reason why we think it might have been called that is this newspaper ad. This is from 1768. So I mentioned Hugh had a mill. He wanted more help with his mill. He puts an ad in the paper. Wanted a Fuller or Sherman, inquire if Hugh Creighton at the Indian King in Haddonfield. So that one document is the basis for historians later on deciding, oh, we're going to name this Indian King Tavern, as our museum. To be honest, every other reference to the tavern in other newspapers always just calls it the House of Hugh Creighton. This is the only one that ever calls it Indian King, so we don't know. But we have the name on our sign. We're not moving it anytime soon, so there you go. So who worked at taverns? It's a lot of work to do. You've got people staying. The Indian King is a big place. It's 3 stories. They estimate maybe even 10 different rooms, multiple people in each room. This is a major undertaking. Hugh and Mary, Mary had the 2 sons. They're grown by this time. One's definitely in Philly. The other might have helped. We're not sure. They had 1 daughter together who was about 15 when they moved into our site, so she probably did some help. They need more help than that. They are relying on enslaved labor. We have a census document from the 1780s that mentions 5 African American inhabitants of our building. And the other document that we have is from 1791. So at this point, this is when Hugh is actually retiring, kind of, folding up his business, and he emancipates a young woman named Flora. So that's kind of why we think the people who lived there were enslaved, because we have this emancipation document. We do hereby certify that Hugh Creighton of the township of Newton, which is what it was called at that time, brought before us his mulatto slave named Flora, and she's given freedom at that time. And it really was a time when you have a lot of emancipation in this area. Slavery was actually going out of style in the Delaware Valley. South Jersey, especially this part, is very culturally linked to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania does a gradual abolition of slavery during the Revolutionary War. The Quaker community, the Society of Friends, in 1776, they officially banned slaveholding among the membership of their religious community. So if you were a Quaker and you owned enslaved people, you would actually be getting a knock on the door from somebody from church saying, what's your plan to emancipate them? And the Quakers are the dominant religious group actually in Haddonfield. So this is definitely a live controversy. And I mentioned Thomas Redmond, who owned the property right before the Creightons bought it. He was the clerk of the Haddonfield Quaker meeting. He was actually the one keeping the list. So he's the one in charge of figuring out whether people are being emancipated or not. So who were guests at taverns? Generally, like the first picture I showed, if you see pictures of taverns, you're going to see a bunch of white guys. That's pretty much, generally who the clientele is. But it's not 100%. It could have been more diverse than we realize. So there's a lot of regulations of taverns in New Jersey law. Here's one from 1751. An act to restrain tavern keepers and others from selling strong liquor to servants and slaves. And basically what it says is you're not allowed to sell alcohol to an enslaved person without their owner's permission. What this kind of says to me, if they bothered to pass a law saying don't sell alcohol to slaves, I kind of think taverns were selling alcohol. You're telling me I'm writing laws saying don't do this if it's not happening. And we certainly know a little bit more about Philadelphia, and there definitely were certain taverns that African American people hung out at, both free and enslaved, and we know that from multiple documents. Women as well. Now, the tavern scene is not generally considered a female-friendly. You had women who were serving, you had people who were working there for sure. Not the women who are considered more classy, let's say. It wasn't like the thing to do to hang out with a bunch of drunk guys. So, women of a certain class were not expected to just go to the tavern and have a drink. However, when you talk about travelers, the tavern was it in terms of overnight accommodation that was paid accommodation. There was no other hotel the way we have today. It was only the tavern or friends and family. And women sometimes travel, and sometimes, that was where you could go. They didn't have anywhere else to stay. And so I've definitely read in diaries of female travelers, we stayed at the tavern last night. So it could happen. I have a little quote from here from sort of a bit of an incident from a lady who stayed overnight at a tavern in Philly named Elizabeth Asbridge. We came to Philadelphia by water. Here we stopped at a tavern, where I became the spectacle and discourse of the company. So she's not having a great time. What's going on? So poor Elizabeth, she was having a bad relationship with her husband. They got married apparently when they were in the romance stage. She was a wonderful dancer, and that was something he found was really attractive, and that was kind of part of their relationship. She became very religious, decided she didn't want to dance anymore, and he was not happy about it. So there at this tavern, there's people there with in musical instruments and stuff. He starts off with people saying, "Hey, play a song, and me and my wife are gonna dance." And she's really unhappy, and so they're playing this song, and he's kind of forcing her to dance, and and the people there, she's being humiliated, she's really upset, and they basically stop it. They're like, "Guy, just stop it, leave your wife alone." So she describes this whole experience in her diary, which is kind of a cool little slice of life from the time period. So what kind of behavior was allowed at the tavern? So when Hugh and Mary got their license, they actually have to put up money as security to the government that they're not going to allow certain inappropriate behavior. So if the wrong thing's happening in the tavern, they can get fined, they can lose their license. One of the things very strictly prohibited is gambling. So it actually says in the paperwork, Hugh Creighton shall not gain nor suffer any person to gain in his house for money. Now remember the first picture I showed you at the beginning? What are the things you noticed? Yeah. I don't know, we're kind of assuming this was what they say honored more in the breach, that it was going on, that people were gambling probably. But it is one of the things that officially we're allowed to do. And they had to put up at that time, the security, it was 60 pounds in those days, which today would be like $1,000. So it's really, that's something we talked about research. I would love to do more research as to like, how many people in our area actually got in trouble for like allowing gambling in the taverns, because I'm not exactly sure. So I think that's it. Okay, so that's gonna do like the end of my part one. That was your bit of like slice of tavern life. I'm gonna open up some questions, and then we'll do part two that gets us into like more of the Revolutionary War stuff. And all these characters that you heard about, you're gonna get to see kind of what happened to them during the war. So any questions I can answer?
They ever use it as a brothel?
Huh?
Did they ever use it as a brothel?
I mean, so I don't know about our tavern specifically. So the Indian King Tavern, I mean, I put a bunch of stuff that I've like found gleaned from bits and pieces, but we don't have like a stack of paperwork, unfortunately. We've got little bits from newspapers, little bit here, little bit there. Taverns in general, it could happen. I've definitely read accounts where there's a lot of like, you got like Yelp reviews. There's a lot of like tavern reviews. Like there's a lot of accounts of like, I was at this tavern, and let me tell you about God, you know. And so I remember specifically reading one. It's like, oh, I was up all night because the bed next to me, this guy had all these girls there, and they were carrying on all night, you know. So it could happen. Again, think about where you are. Probably more likely in Philly, like near the port area, than Haddonfield. Tended to be a little bit more staid. It was a kind of Quaker town, a little bit uptight. So I'm going to give you and Mary the benefit of the doubt, but that kind of stuff could happen, for sure, yeah.
Was there like a police department or anything that was called like a jail nearby? Or?
That's a great question. I mean, official police, I mean, what is it, like was it constable? I mean, you could get arrested. I know there's definitely like court proceedings about taverns, and again, I know a little bit more Philadelphia because more's been written about it, but definitely people could be charged what they call like running a baughty house.
Yeah.
So people could be brought up on charges.
Were like the patrons who got in trouble there, would they be carted out and put in a?
I think it's usually more the tavern keeper, but I could be wrong. I was just reading last night, there's this one in Philadelphia, there's a whole court case where they're saying bad stuff at a tavern, or what allegedly happened is they said a bunch of guys were cavorting in women's dress, and a bunch of women were in men's dress with masks, and they're like, this is not appropriate, and there's like a court case about that. But yeah, the idea of like people storming in, and like what you're imagining, like during Prohibition.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with it, but I might not know. Like, I only know what I know, and sometimes, like, I know a lot about Indian King, but sometimes historical stuff, I'll be asked a great question, I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to mislead you and pretend to know more than I do. I think at that time, you know, it's a very small population, so like all these kind of services are kind of minimal. The major thing when you look at like the local government, like the departments that are operating, the big things for local government were roads, committees to deal with creating roads, and what's called the Guardians of the Poor. Welfare, actually. That's when you see the local government, those are like the first two big committees are roads and the poor. So people are taxed, and then that tax money is going to help people who are less fortunate and need financial assistance.
Okay.
And there are courts, and the Gloucester court is the big court in the area. So Camden County didn't exist, so we were part of Gloucester County, and then the court was in Gloucester, in town of Gloucester. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
You know, one of my favorite programs and shows that I watch is Rawhide.
Is
Rawhide.
Oh, I
It's
don't know.
a cowboy
Yeah.
Clint Eastwood thing
Oh,
that
cool.
comes on
Yeah.
HGTV every morning.
Yeah.
And in their taverns that they stopped at, as they're hoarding the cows, they have gambling with the cards. In every single bar or
Yeah.
you know, tavern that they go into, there's some guys sitting there playing poker. And they always refer to the Northeast as being the high society. Like, everything has to be just like suit and ties and, you know, more
Yeah.
formal
Compared to the
than
West,
down in
yeah.
Texas, you know,
Right,
and going
sure.
up to, you know, like Alabama and all the other places where they did the cows. So I wonder if it was something that, like, on our coast, that they looked down upon, you know, the Southwest as far as gambling. Oh, we're not gonna do that in our taverns. Is that what their mentality was when they weren't gonna have like poker in their taverns, when you see it on TV and all the
Yeah.
westerns?
I mean, I think part of it is thinking about the time period. So, like, when we're talking colonial times, I mean, like, Texas wasn't even a thing yet. So there was the West. The West for them would be like central Pennsylvania now. Like Lancaster County and stuff is almost like the West. So the whole like move from east to west was still early. I think that part of it was religious. So you have, you know, the Quakers, they're very like devout, and so they had certain ideas that just wasn't like proper and Christian to do a lot of things. And the same thing for the Puritans who were in New England. So there's just a lot of this sort of Christian religious idea of like what like a moral society is. It wasn't just about gambling, it was even about things like the theater. So should we have like shows? Like actually South Street in Philly was kind of the border of the town, because you could have all the crazy stuff going on like right on the other side of the official town border. It was kind of frowned upon. But you see very early, like Philadelphia was settled by William Penn, and he's like a very, you know, ideological person. Like he wants to create this like utopia. And so part of it is like giving people rights, like religious freedom, like criminal justice reform, but part of it is very much this idea that people are going to be what he considered good. And that meant not so much partying, not so much gambling, like that was all kind of was frowned upon, I think. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so you have like within the East Coast different classes. And the same is true for taverns. You know, in Haddonfield, it's a really small place. Haddonfield Revolutionary War time had 2 taverns, went up to 3 briefly during the war, but Philly had like over 100, and there were different ones. And there was like one called City Tavern that you can still see today, although it's a reconstruction on 2nd Street. That was built by rich people for rich people. So that was like, we're gonna have a classy upper society tavern. And then you have little ones by the port. It's got a different clientele, poorer people, and they're constantly trying to crack down in the licenses. The government with taverns that they think of as like not classy enough. They're like, oh, this tavern had the wrong kind of people, all this riffraff, you know, in that tavern, that's bad. And then if people couldn't get licensed, they would run unlicensed taverns. So if you don't want to follow all these rules, you could do it yourself, then you'd go in court for being unlicensed. So they kept on kind of trying to crack down. But I think like having disdain, I think that you're definitely right in terms of like East Coast people looking down on West Coast people, 100%.
When you're referring to, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you're referring to unlicensed taverns, was the license to run a tavern specifically involving the sale of alcohol, or was that like an after?
Always alcohol. Yeah. Yeah. Alcohol was,
Tavern slash alcohol license, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
yes.
Because you originally spoke of housing and not housing necessarily, but hotel mentality.
It,
But then you
al-
went to the
it
housing.
always included
Okay.
alcohol.
Okay.
You know, because people just drank, like alcohol was just part of your diet. It would be like having a restaurant and not being able to serve bread. Like that was how weird that would sound at that time, because the water wasn't safe. So people pretty much drank alcohol. One thing I didn't mention is that prices were regulated. So the tavern keepers had maximum prices they were allowed to charge for different things. And we have some of those documents. It's really cool because we can see what the taverns were likely to serve. And it's mostly, the licenses are all alcohol. For the food, it just says like best dinner, second best dinner, third best dinner. Because they couldn't really say, oh, this much for the beef, like it'd be crazy. So it's mostly like this much for this wine, it's all these different mixed drinks. And then also coffee, tea, and hot chocolate. So it's either the caffeine or the alcohol. But you're not getting soft drinks, and water was not always that safe. It could be contaminated. Okay, you ready for the war?
Okay.
All right. militiamen here. And I put our seal back of Elizabeth Haddon to kind of remind us, and I already talked about this, you know, Haddonfield is a pretty conservative town. It's a religious community. It's a Quaker community. And one thing that you could ask you for your association with Quakers, how do they feel about war? No. So Quakers today, even today, are pacifists. I once dated a guy who didn't like being in the army. The Quakers actually helped him to like desert. Like they will still do things like that. And that pacifist tradition was already well developed by this time. Before the Revolutionary War, there was a war called the French and Indian War, and a lot of Quakers were resisting helping with that war, resisting participating in that war. So they already have this strong tradition of not wanting war. So we're having all these problems with the British, you know, taxation without representation, all this stuff. There's a lot of agreement among Americans that they're unhappy with the British government, but where you start to have disagreement is what should be done about it. And a lot of people are like, yeah, we don't like what the king's doing, what the parliament's doing, but are we gonna go so far as to be independent? Are we gonna go so far as to have like an armed conflict? A lot of people are like, no, that's too far. So that you get a lot of disagreement. And for the Quakers, they were basically telling their community, not just don't fight, not just don't go to battle, that the revolution is not legitimate, that the government, the revolutionary government, is not a legitimate government. So it's pretty strong. And so this is kind of a bit of the background. So for the Quakers, if one of their congregants is doing the whole revolution thing, then often they will be what's called disowned from the Quaker community. That's the thing that could happen to you when I mentioned slavery before. If you persisted in owning enslaved people when you weren't supposed to, you could be disowned. Same thing for being a revolutionary. So our friends Hugh and Mary Creighton, the tavern keepers. So Hugh Creighton was not a Quaker, but it seems that Mary's first husband was. And so her two sons from her first marriage seem to have been brought up in the Quaker community. They both did become revolutionaries. They both signed up. And we have here a document from 1776 from the Philadelphia Quaker meeting regarding Charles, that's one of Mary's sons from her first marriage. He hath disunited himself from fellowship with us. And that's because he joined the militia. So he is disowned. And this is not uncommon. I saw an estimate that about 14% of people at Quakers in New Jersey were disowned for supporting the revolution. So this is a big thing, and I'm sure same in Pennsylvania as well. And so it's interesting because after the war is over, you have a large community of like ex-Quakers. So they were Quakers, they've been disowned because they supported the revolution, but actually they kind of still want to worship, you know, in Quaker style and stuff like that. So they set up their own new religious community called the Society of Free Quakers. And if you visit Philadelphia today, the Free Quaker Meeting House is right near the Visitor Center, still standing. It's actually the oldest Quaker meeting house still standing is actually the Free Quakers. And one of the founders of the Free Quaker movement is a man named Timothy Matlack Jr. If you have a really good memory, you might remember from part one. So his dad is that beer brewer who built the first buildings on our site. So he's the son of basically the first person who built the buildings at our museum site. He was founder of the Free Quakers, helped design their meeting house. What he's probably more famous for is he was a clerk for the Continental Congress, which is our like national government during the war. They had him write a lot of their big documents, including the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration, the fancy like handwritten version, like the John Hancock and everybody signed, that's actually Timmy's handwriting. So that's like a cool little connection we have. So Timothy was a revolutionary, so were Mary's kids, but you also have people who were like holding the traditional Quaker line. So Thomas Redmond, who we already got to know, right? And I mentioned to you, he's the clerk of the Haddonfield meeting. He's very involved in, in the Quaker religious community. He gets in trouble because the Philadelphia Quakers are writing a letter to kind of all the smaller Quaker groups with advice, telling them, don't support the war, don't acknowledge the revolutionary government. He, as the clerk of the Haddonfield meeting, is reading out that letter, as he should, to his Congress. congregants, he gets arrested for that. He's in prison in Woodbury for weeks because he was refusing to sign oaths of loyalty to the revolutionary government. He's in prison for weeks. Eventually, about 2 months almost, I think, he has a trial. He is found guilty, but they kind of take pity on him. They're like, this isn't a dangerous guy. He's just, he's just a peaceful guy. So he's found guilty officially, but he's just given a small fine as his penalty. Of course, he doesn't want to pay the fine, because that would be acknowledging that this trial is even legitimate. But luckily for him, some anonymous donors swoop in, and the fines are just paid. So they're like in court, and the bailiff's like, hey, looks like the fine's paid. So he gets to go home. But that's his experience. I mentioned briefly there was another guy who owned the property before him called Matthias Aspden. He was a loyalist. He actually left America when the revolution started to get away from it all. So we see even among the people involved in just this building, you got people on taking all these different positions. And I just learned today that Pemberton is named after a Quaker loyalist, so it's very, very common. So this is kind of the atmosphere in town, and in comes the government. So January 1777, and we don't really know why they chose Haddonfield. I mean, there were a lot of battles in different places. It might have just seemed safe and away from the front lines at that time. But January 1777, the revolutionary government of New Jersey comes to town, and they're going to rent out the second floor in our building. That's Governor William Livingston. He's the first governor of the state of New Jersey. He's going to be there, the whole assembly, and they're, trying to win the war. They're trying to deal with all these people who are not really on board. One of the big things they're debating is militia service. So you've got George Washington and his Continental Army. That's more of a voluntary thing that you sign up to join George Washington's army, make a contract. There's also local militia. Think of it like the National Guard. So you sign up, it doesn't mean you're going off to war, you can still stay at home, you do some drills, and then if you're needed, if the battlefront is close to you, you might be called up. That was mandatory for all New Jersey citizens, but you could get out of it by paying money. And George Washington did not like that. So George Washington is leaning very hard on Governor Livingston, saying you need to make changes. And he writes in his letter, I want men, not money. Like, I need people here. However, they make some changes, but basically the assembly that's meeting in our room is one of the big things they're discussing. They don't accommodate George Washington. They keep that option to pay instead of serving. And Governor Livingston explains that's because these are elected officials. And they worry if they say everybody has to serve, they're going to lose their seat, they're going to lose their election. So they've got people not wanting to do it, that's why they keep this option. So it's democracy, just like today, right? We might say this is what should happen, but if the politicians think they're going to lose the election for doing it, they're not going to do it. So that's the kind of decisions that are going on in this room. Other thing, they're trying to figure out all these loyalists, right? Now you've got the threat of people like Haddonfield kind of loyalists I was telling you about. The big threat, to be honest, is people in North Jersey, because the British had occupied New York at this time, and they don't want people from North Jersey trading with the British. So that's really the big deal. Also, they're locking up loyalists because British are locking up revolutionaries, and they want to do a prisoner exchange. You can't exchange prisoners if you don't have any prisoners. So that's part of what's going on. So what they established a thing called the Committee of Safety. It's basically Governor Livingston and like 12 people around him. I kind of call them the Inquisition. So anyone who's suspected of being loyalist is kind of brought in and interrogated by them. And they're actually imprisoned before their interrogation in the building directly across the street from the Taverns, still standing today. It's called the Guardhouse. So this building is still around. That was like the temporary jail where suspected loyalists were held and then brought into our building for questioning. So I highlighted for you just a couple stories to kind of give you a sense of it, of what was going on. So I'm going to start with the first one. His Excellency was pleased to lay before the board, that's kind of like the Committee of Safety, a letter from Mrs. Catherine Rutherford requesting that Mr. Rutherford, her husband, may be released from confinement. So Mr. Rutherford is a loyalist. He's been put in jail, in prison, by the revolutionaries. His wife is a civilian. She's living on this farm. She comes to the committee of safety and she says, you know, my husband's in jail. I've got kids. I've been having health problems. My kids have been having health problems. It's really hard for us on the farm right now. There's a lot of stuff that we need a man. We need the man in the house. Like, there's just stuff that we can't do, and we're really in tough circumstances. So she says, can you please let him go home? Keep him under house arrest. I understand you don't want him involved in helping the British, but can you kind of just do house arrest instead of being in prison? So I open up to you guys. What do you think? If you were the committee of safety, what would you tell her?
Send him home.
Huh?
Send him home and
Send
keep
him
him
home.
in home arrest.
Agreement. Oh, you're a very peace-loving group. I've had a lot of people, yeah, don't necessarily. So they kind of compromise. They do let him go home, but they say only for 10 days, and then he has to go back to prison. So the idea is he'll go in, if there's some really heavy lifting that needs to happen at the farm, you've got 10 days to really just go for it, do some farm work, help his family, then you come back. Now, of course, we don't know the whole paper trail. Did he really go back? Did he run away? Like, we don't know. We just have these few sentences, but it's kind of like a cool snippet, I think, like slice of life. Other one I just want to tell you about, John Henchman, major local Haddonfield guy. So Mr. Isaac Kay appeared before the board and was examined, touching the conduct and suspicious behavior of John Henchman, Esquire. So John Henchman is a local person. Isaac Kay is a local Haddonfield guy. He ran a mill right on the border between Haddonfield and Cherry Hill. We have all these people, that names I know from local history, including like descendants of Elizabeth Haddon-Estow, the founder, are testifying about this guy, John Henchman, that he's suspected of not being cool with the revolution. Apparently his sister had some British officers over for tea, yada yada. It's like very personal, you know, the people who, like you guys are in this historical society. It's like if one member, they're like, oh, I know you know this person in the historical society. Have they ever said anything to you, political, whatever views? You know, have you ever brought in to give evidence? So John Henchman is brought in. He's given the option, like most people are, to swear an oath of loyalty to the revolutionary government. He refused to do that, so bad news for him. Generally, when you refuse, you're usually bound over for another more formal court proceeding. Not sure exactly what happened, but this is May. A few months later, the British are going to take control of Philly, and when that happens, he absconds to the British. So he really becomes a loyalist. He goes over to the British side, and all his property is confiscated. And among his property in Haddonfield, so remember Hugh and Mary, and I said that they had the tavern across the street, and their landlord helped them get their license? That's this guy. He's their former landlord. He's the one who helped them. So that property is confiscated. They actually auction off that former property where they used to be renting their former tavern. The auction takes place at the Indian King. Because taverns are often used as places for auctions, public buildings. So talk about full circle, right? Here's a guy who helped sponsor you in your business. Now you're actually like, your building is hosting auctioning off that property. Since he lost all of his property in South Jersey, the British gave him some property in Canada after the war. That happens a lot because they still control Canada. So he has to go up to Canada, doesn't like it so much. After the war is over, he tries to come back to New Jersey, reclaim his property. According to what he wrote, he said he's treated very badly, it's a very hostile reaction, and the whole situation is so stressful that he said his wife had a nervous breakdown and he had a stroke that he attributed to the stress. And that's the last we know of John Henchman. So how do you see that, you know, the stress that the community is under? So I kind of put these out of order, but the first one you kind of see September of '77. That's pretty much the last gasp of the New Jersey government being in Haddonfield. They pretty much leave like a few days after that because the British occupy Philly. And as soon as the British occupy Philly, it's too dangerous for the government to remain in Haddonfield, so they go away from Philadelphia to Princeton after that in the fall. But that's not the end of our story. It's a little bit more. We still have some drama because, you know, the British are in Philly, right? So they're in Philly. Now the British, when they attacked Philadelphia, they attacked it from the west, meaning they controlled the city, but they did not yet control the Delaware River. So their first order of business is we need to get control of the Delaware River. There were 2 Revolutionary forts, Mifflin and Mercer, on the 2 sides of the Delaware. So one thing they do, they send a group of Hessians across the river to attack Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side. It was called Red Bank, New Jersey today. So the Hessians cross the river and they spend overnight in Haddonfield. And then the next day they continue to Red Bank. So 2 of the people that go with them to help them, so the Hessians, they don't know the area, right? They're from Germany. So they're Haddonfield. One of their big priorities is like, I'm supposed to fight this battle. Like, how do I get there? Like, where is this place? So they're trying to recruit local people to help them figure out where they're going to fight their battle. And 2 of the people who they recruit are these people called Dick Ellis and John McElvain. Dick Ellis was an African-American man enslaved to Joseph Ellis, who's actually the head of the militia for Gloucester County, for that area. According to oral history, shortly before this whole battle goes down, this is how the Tavern link. This is from a book of kind of collecting reminiscences from people from the war from the 1840s. At the bar of the Haddonfield Tavern, so we're not sure which one, could have been ours, maybe just another one, sorry. These 2 loyal fellows were very loud in their abuse of the American cause. And that's referring to Dick Ellis and McElvain. And by the way, so that mentioned, were there black people at taverns? According to this memory, there were. They're hanging out at the tavern, they're dissing the revolution. Well, that's oral history, but what's documented history is when the Hessians come into town, they join the Hessians, they guide them to Red Bank. Battle happens, the revolutionaries win the battle, and they capture Ellis and McElvain. They are court-martialed for what they had done, acting as guides for the enemy, and they are found guilty, they are executed, and they are hung and buried in the battlefield. So if you go visit the Red Bank battlefield, there's a lot of people buried there who died in the battle. These are among what would be the people who are under the ground as we walk around. Now, we don't know everybody's motivation, but I have to say, Dick Ellis, as an enslaved person, the British were offering at that time freedom to people who were enslaved by revolutionaries. And remember, the person who owns him is a revolutionary, as a colonel. So that could have been part of his motivation. If it was, it definitely ended in tragedy. To make this a little bit of a happier story, not for him, but I just did even more research yesterday. From Burlington, there is a black guy from Burlington who was enslaved to the head of the Burlington Revolutionary Militia. He succeeded. He ended up going over to the British side. He ended up, after the war, gaining freedom, being able to immigrate to Canada, just like we mentioned with Hinchman, under the auspices of the British. And there's even some documentation in New Brunswick, Canada, that he became a landowner later in his life. The Caesar Claus from Burlington. And we'll kind of the final real story in terms of the tavern itself. So we got the British in Philadelphia. We have all this different activity going on in South Jersey. And in April, in the spring of 1778, the British are raiding Haddonfield looking for revolutionary militia. And so they come into town, they get to the tavern itself about like 3:30 a.m. They are, apparently there is a militia guy there who actually jumps out the window. This is according to people remembered. They're stealing things, they're breaking windows, and we've got Mary Creighton in there and her daughter Polly, who's about 16. Apparently Polly had been sick. Mary was, terrified. These enemy soldiers, I've got a 16-year-old. So you see the lovely mahogany dresser right there? That is the Creighton's dresser. That room we have done up as their bedroom, but it's not really their stuff. That is their actual dresser. And Mary told her daughter, you see it's a big mahogany dresser, told her daughter to hide behind the dresser so that enemy soldiers couldn't see her. And that story was actually inscribed, so that story was passed down in like family oral history, and then later a descendant actually inscribed that story in the back of the dresser. So that dresser went on auction, on Sotheby's auction, and then it has in the auction listing, the inscription in the back. So some of the color I told you and other stuff that happened is more from the 1845 book. We think Polly was probably interviewed because she went on to be a pretty important person in her own right, and her son became a governor of New Jersey, so it makes sense she might have been somebody who was interviewed. But the specifics of hiding behind the dresser is actually literally the dresser. So I always tell people, you want people to remember your history, remember your family, think about carving it in the furniture. Someone's gonna read it, you know? Paper gets lost, your phone, who's ever gonna find that again? But you put it in the bookcase, you know, it might survive. So so that's kind of the spring, and then the British leave, they withdraw from Philadelphia in the summer, they do march through Haddonfield again, steal a bunch of cows. There's a great story about one guy, as they're stealing all these cows, I think it's from the Morristown area, there's an American patriot, of course he's angry at the British as they're going back, so he decides to play a trick on them and spook the cows. So he has this apron, and so he starts frantically waving the apron like this, and the cows get spooked and stampede into the woods of Morristown. So, don't know if it's true, but that's what people remember. So, bye British. So that one kind of ends my revolutionary story, and I do like to, since I'm talking about taverns, bring it around and, is this loading properly? Let's see. Not with my phone. Let's see. And end with a little song. This is a war song. It actually dates first from the French and Indian War. That was kind of sung by soldiers, but it was popular in the Revolutionary War as well. There's actually a whole scholarly article that it was Alexander Hamilton's favorite song. And if there's any Hamilton fans here, but the night before Hamilton died in a duel, he went out partying in a tavern, and there's some evidence that he might have actually sung this song the night before he died. So I thought I would kind of play that to wrap things up. Now, it's not working, I can put it on my phone.
Hit, yeah.
Yeah, I got it.
I haven't been able to take my eyes off my husband's pants since he tried this morning trick. What happened afterward was
Oh, sorry.
just another
No control over that.
Lucky we're all adults. Well, most of us. Some of us are.
Stands the lads around, for shame ye take no care. The boy's house stands the lads around, let mirth and wine abound. The trumpet sound, the colors they are flying, boys to fight, kill or wound. May we still be found, content with our fate, we boys on the whole ground.
I'll just speed up a little bit because it's a long song.
Should next and then send us to men who made us boys with free campaign. But if we remain,
Yeah, you can imagine them swaying, right? Alright, there we go. So raise a glass.
Here, here.